To understand the Battle of Plataea, we must first strip away the Hollywood gloss of the 300 Spartans. By the summer of 479 BC, the legendary stand at Thermopylae was already a year old. Leonidas was dead. His skin had been tanned, and his head spiked by the great King Xerxes. But more importantly, the myth of Spartan invincibility had been punctured. While pop culture remembers Thermopylae as a triumph of the spirit, for the Greeks living in 479 BC, it was a strategic catastrophe. Central Greece had fallen. Athens was no longer a city. It was a graveyard of scorched stone. The Parthenon was a blackened shell, its treasures looted, its gods insulted. The Athenian people were refugees, huddled on the rocky shores of the island of Salamis, watching the smoke of their homes drift across the Aegean. History often forgets that after the naval victory at Salamis, Xerxes went home, but he did not take his army. He left behind his most clinical and dangerous commander, Mardonius. He left 300,000 professional killers with a simple directive: finish it. This wasn't just a war anymore, it was a trauma. The Greeks were homeless, starving, and abandoned by their own gods. The vengeance we are about to explore wasn't a noble quest. It was a desperate, bloody necessity. This is the story of how 10,000 Spartans and a mass of 35,000 slaves stepped out of the shadows of defeat to execute the greatest decapitation strike in ancient history. We must address a massive historical misconception: the idea that the Persians were a mindless horde of unskilled slaves. If you believe this, you don't understand why the Greeks were so terrified. General Mardonius had trimmed the fat of the imperial army. He sent the conscripts back to Susa and kept the professionals. These were the immortals, the 10,000 elite heavy infantry who wore scale armor under their tunics. These were the Saka horse archers, men who could shoot an arrow through a gap in a helmet while riding at a full gallop without stirrups. Mardonius didn't want to fight in narrow mountain passes again. He wanted the open plains. He withdrew to Boeotia and built a fortified camp that was essentially a city of wood and iron. Archaeologists and historians, including the primary source Herodotus, described this stockade as a masterpiece of ancient logistics. It held 250,000 men and tens of thousands of horses. Mardonius sat in this city of war like a spider in a web. He controlled the flat ground. He knew that if the Greeks came down into the dirt, his cavalry would chew them to pieces. The Persian strategy was clinical, environmental sabotage. They didn't need to charge the Spartans. They just needed to wait for them to starve. When the Spartan mobilization order finally came, the ground of the Peloponnese literally shook. 5,000 Spartiates, the full-blooded citizen warriors, prepared to march. But for every one Spartan, there were 7 others, who history rarely names: the Helots. The Helots were a subjugated population, essentially state-owned slaves from the region of Messenia. The 30,000 Spartans at Plataea were actually a massive combined force of 5,000 elite knights and 35,000 armed helots. Why arm your slaves? Because the Spartan logistics required it. Each helot was a porter, a servant, and a light-armed skirmisher. They carried the 60-pound bronze panoply for their masters. They protected the flanks. Without the helots, the Spartan army would have collapsed under its own weight before reaching the border. The free est men in Greece were supported by the most oppressed. At Plataea, these two classes, master and slave, would have to bleed into the same mud if either were to survive the Persian tide. The two armies met at the Asopus River. For 11 days, a high-stakes, staring contest ensued. Pausanias, the Spartan regent, was a man of iron patience. He refused to go down into the plain. He hugged the foothills where the Persian horses couldn't maneuver. Mardonius grew impatient. He didn't want a siege. He wanted a massacre. He unleashed his cavalry commander, Masistius, a man who rode a Nisaean stallion with a golden bridle. The cavalry harassed the Greek lines, raining arrows and insults. In a small but pivotal skirmish, the Athenians managed to kill Masistius, but even in death, he proved the Persian technical superiority. The Greeks couldn't kill him initially because he was wearing a suit of impenetrable scale armor under his purple tunic. They finally had to jam a spear into his eye slit to drop him. Humiliated by the loss of Masistius, Mardonius tightened the noose. He sent his horsemen to the Gargaphia spring. This was the only water source for 110,000 Greeks. In a single afternoon of vandalism, the Persian cavalry trampled the spring into a slurry of mud and silt. An army of 110,000 men without water in the August sun has a life expectancy of about 48 hours. Pausanias was forced to move. He ordered a night retreat to find a new water source. If you think military history is always organized, the night of the Greek retreat will prove you wrong. It was a comedy of errors. The center of the Greek line panicked and fled miles away to the town of Plataea. The Athenians got lost in the foothills, and on the right wing, the Spartans were paralyzed by a single man's pride, Captain Amompharitus. Amompharitus refused to move. He argued that Spartans never retreat. Pausanias, the supreme commander, was reduced to having a screaming match with his own captain in the dark, while 300,000 Persians sat just hundreds of yards away. In a mocking display of Spartan democracy, Amompharitus picked up a massive boulder and slammed it at Pausanias' feet. "With this pebble," he shouted, "I cast my vote not to flee from the strangers." Because of this one man's stubbornness, the sun rose to find the Spartan army isolated, disorganized, and completely exposed on the ridges. Mardonius looked out from his camp, saw the fractured Greek line, and laughed. He didn't even wait for his heavy infantry to form up. He simply pointed his sword and yelled, "Get them!" This, the moment where the Battle of Plataea becomes a psychological horror film. 53,000 Spartans and Tigans were caught mid-march. Mardonius's archers planted their wicker shields, the gera, and created a wall. Then they began to darken the sky. The Spartan tactics here are a study in staged passivity. Pausanias ordered his men to drop to one knee and lock shields. He refused to charge. Why? Because the omens were bad. For nearly an hour, the Spartans sat there. They didn't move as arrows found the gaps in their bronze. They didn't move as their brothers bled out beside them. They were waiting for the green light from the gods, but tactically, they were waiting for the Persians to commit their infantry so they could be trapped in close-quarters combat. Imagine the Helots in this moment. They didn't have bronze shields. They had animal skins and wicker. They were dying in droves to protect the backs of their masters. Finally, as the Persians were so close, they could see the sweat on the Spartans' faces. A third sacrifice was made. The liver was good. Pausanias stood up. He didn't need a trumpet. The iron discipline that had kept 10,000 men frozen in a storm of arrows suddenly released. The statues came to life. The collision of the two armies was not the clang of swords. It was the sickening crunch of wood shattering under the weight of bronze. The Persians were brave. Herodotus is clear on this. But bravery cannot defeat physics. The Greeks called this phase the othymos, or the shove. The Spartan phalanx was essentially a human tank. The Persian archers fought with short daggers and light spears. The Spartans had the dory, an 8-foot ash spear tipped with iron. The Persians tried to grab the spears with their bare hands to snap them, but as soon as they did, the Spartans drew the xiphos, their short, leaf-shaped butchery swords. Was a massacre. The Persians were wearing linen, or scale armor, designed for arrow protection. Against a Spartan thrust, it was like paper. The Spartans moved with a robotic, industrial efficiency. Stab, bash, step. In the center of the chaos, Arimnestos, a Spartan whose name means the one who is remembered, saw Mardonius on his white horse. He lunged. A massive stone, or a spear. History debates which crushed the general's skull. The moment Mardonius hit the dirt, the Persian Empire died in Europe. The immortal units, seeing their leader fallen, finally broke. 40,000 Persian reserves under Artabazus saw the carnage, turned their horses around, and marched straight out of Greece without striking a single blow.
Take what you can! Move quickly!
The remaining Persians retreated to their wooden stockade. They were trapped. The Spartans, usually poor at sieges, watched as the Athenians breached the wall. What followed was an extermination. The Greeks took no prisoners. They moved through the camp and killed everything that breathed. Of the hundreds of thousands who began the day, ancient sources claim only 3,000 survived the slaughter. Pausanias walked into Mardonius' tent. He saw gold-plated furniture, silver tables, and silk hangings worth more than the entire city of Sparta. He ordered the captured chefs to cook a royal Persian feast. Then he ordered his own cooks to make black broth, the bitter, unappetizing Spartan staple of pork blood and vinegar. He pointed at the two meals and laughed. "Look at the folly of the Persian," he said. He had all this, and he came to rob us of our poverty. It's a powerful image, but it's also a warning. The gold Pausanias mocked that day would eventually be his undoing. The Battle of Plataea was the ugly victory. It saved Western civilization, but it destroyed the men who won it. The alliance between Sparta and Athens immediately shattered. Athens used the prestige of the victory to build a naval empire that would eventually lead to the Peloponnesian War. Pausanias, the man who laughed at the Persian gold, became addicted to it. Years later, he was caught wearing Persian robes and plotting with the great king. He was chased into the temple of Athena by his own people. The Spartans bricked up the doors to let him starve. Legend says his own mother placed the first stone. Thermopylae is the story we tell because it is clean. The 300 died, and they stayed beautiful in their defeat. But Plataea is the story we to remember. It was messy, it was brutal, and it was won by masters and slaves fighting side by side in the mud. The 300 Spartans gave Greece its soul at Thermopylae. But the 10,000 Spartans at Plataea gave it its life. And as always, thank you for supporting deep historical education. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep these stories alive.